Whispers of the Past. Lydia stood on the cracked driveway, staring at the weathered remains of her childhood home. It looked like it had drifted ashore after a storm, each wooden panel darkened and frayed like charred driftwood. She inhaled deeply, and the faint smell of burnt pine washed over her, as if the house itself was exhaling a ghostly reminder of what it once was. Memories swirled, overwhelming her, childhood laughter, whispered secrets, and darker moments she preferred to leave buried. A hand landed gently on her shoulder, pulling her back to the present. She turned to see her twin brother, Ben, his familiar face lined with both weariness and warmth. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" he murmured. "Like, stepping into someone else's dream." Lydia tried to swallow the lump forming in her throat. "It feels like, yesterday and a lifetime ago, all at once." Ben pulled her into a hug, and she melted into his embrace, grounding herself in his steady presence. He smelled of cedar and faint aftershave, a sharp contrast to the stale, dusty air around them. "God, I missed you, Ben," she whispered, holding him tight. "Missed you too, Lyds," he said softly, resting his chin on her head. "But it's not just us coming back here, you know. We've changed. But this place hasn't." Lydia pulled back to look up at him, a flicker of doubt shadowing her gaze. "I don't know if I have, though," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes I feel like I'm still stuck here, in all of this." She gestured at the house with a shaky hand, as though the weight of their shared past had been wrapped up in its crumbling walls. Ben's expression softened, his hand reaching to grasp hers, his thumb gently rubbing over her knuckles. "You're not stuck, Lyds. We just carry pieces of this place with us. You've come a long way, whether you feel it or not." She gave a small, hesitant nod, and they turned to face the house together. The worn facade seemed to watch them, dark windows like empty eyes, offering no comfort. As Lydia took another tentative step towards the house, she glanced over at Ben, watching the way he carried himself. Even here, surrounded by memories and ghosts, he looked unshaken. His gaze was steady, his shoulders squared with a calm resolve, a rock against the tide of everything this house stirred up. She admired him for it, even envied him a little. "Nothing rattles you, does it?" she asked, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Ben raised an eyebrow, giving her a half-smile. "You know that's not true," he replied. "I'm just better at pretending." He nudged her shoulder, teasingly. "One of us had to be." "Lucky you," Lydia muttered, looking down at her hands. "I'm more like a live wire, half the time." She laughed, but the sound came out hollow. "I was always a mess, wasn't I?" Ben shook his head, his face softening. "No, not a mess. Just more intense. Passionate. You feel everything so deeply. Nothing wrong with that. Maybe, but it always felt like you were the one pulling me back when I went too far. The one holding me together when I couldn't." She took a shaky breath, meeting his eyes. "I don't think I would have made it without you, Ben. Especially these past couple of years." Ben's expression became serious. "Hey, you're the one who's done the hard work, Lyds. You're the one who decided to get sober. I was just here to help out. To keep you steady." Lydia smiled, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You were the anchor, Ben. Every time I thought I'd slip, you were there, reminding me why I had to keep going." She took a deep breath, glancing down at her feet. It terrifies me, you know. That one day, I'll be on my own, and I'll lose it." He placed a firm hand on her shoulder, squeezing it gently. "You're not going to lose it. You've come so far, Lydia. And, whatever happens, I'll always be here. Maybe you're flighty," he teased, grinning, "but you're also resilient. You fought for yourself. Even when it wasn't easy." For a moment, Lydia felt a sense of relief. But it wasn't long before the memories, like relentless waves, came crashing back. She stared at the house, its weathered boards peeling and buckling, each crack and crevice a reminder of what they'd lost. It was impossible to look at it and not remember the fire. You ever wonder how things would have turned out if that night hadn't happened? Lydia's voice trembled. If Mom hadn't. Ben sighed, his expression growing somber. I think about it every day. But we can't change it, Lydia. The fire, losing them, it's just part of our story. She swallowed, nodding slowly. I know. It's just, we never had a choice, did we? After they died, it felt like we didn't get to decide anything for ourselves. We became this unit. This strange, broken team that no one else could understand. Ben's eyes softened with empathy. We did. And it was hard, LYDS. But we got each other through it. Even if we were all we had left. Maybe we were all we needed, Lydia whispered, gripping his hand. I mean, look at us. Here we are, years later. Still tangled up in all this. She gave a weak smile, her voice barely audible. You're all I've got, Ben. He wrapped an arm around her shoulder, pulling her close. And you're all I've got, LYDS. We might be broken, but we're still here. Together. They stood in silence, clinging to each other, bound by the memories of what they'd lost and what they'd managed to save, however scarred and fractured it might be. The tragedy that had claimed their family had only strengthened their bond, one they knew was inseparable, no matter how much time passed. Ben turned the old brass doorknob, and the front door groaned open with a sound that felt like an ache from deep within the house's bones. Dust drifted through the air, illuminated by a sliver of light from the setting sun. He gestured for Lydia to enter first. Welcome home, he murmured softly, offering a sad smile as she stepped inside. Lydia crossed the threshold, her senses assaulted by a mixture of decay and familiarity. The peeling wallpaper, the faint scent of mothballs, the worn wooden floors, it was as if the house had been waiting, as broken as they were, suspended in time. It's exactly the same, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She ran a hand along the wall, fingertips brushing over grooves and cracks in the paint. Like it's trapped. Ben closed the door behind them. Feels that way, doesn't it? Like every memory we tried to leave behind just settled here, filling up the empty spaces. Lydia turned to him, her gaze softening. But we didn't leave them all behind, did we? He met her eyes, something unreadable in his expression. No, he said, voice rough. Some things, you just can't shake. She looked down, a strange weight in her chest. Her eyes traced along the scar that cut across his eyebrow, a line that held years of unspoken pain and regret. She swallowed hard, her throat tightening. Ben, she began, her voice trembling. Every time I see that scar, I remember what I did. That night, when I nearly. Lydia, stop, he interrupted gently, but firmly. He lifted a hand, touching the scar with a lightness that seemed almost reverent. You don't need to keep punishing yourself. But I was the one driving, Ben. Her voice was barely audible, each word laced with guilt. If I hadn't been so reckless, so lost in my own mess, you wouldn't. It was an accident, LYDS. Ben's tone softened. And it's over. You've been sober for 2 years. You've come so far. You need to stop dragging yourself back to that night. She shook her head, her voice cracking. I can't. Every time I see that scar, I feel like I'm right back there. The way the car twisted, the sound of you screaming. You almost died, Ben. Because of me. Ben reached out and gently took her by the shoulders. His hands were warm and steady, grounding her in the moment. Look at me, Lydia. I'm here. I survived. And I chose to forgive you. You just haven't chosen to forgive yourself yet. She bit her lip, her gaze dropping. How can I? After everything I put you through? Because, he said, gently tilting her chin up so she had to look him in the eye, we're more than just that night. You're more than that night. This scar, it's a reminder, sure. But it also reminds me of everything we fought through together. Of everything you overcame. Lydia reached out, her hand hovering over the scar before she finally let herself touch it. Her fingers traced the faint line, lingering there, as if she could somehow erase the past by sheer will. I never wanted to hurt you. You were the one person who believed in me, who held me together when I couldn't hold myself up. And I still believe in you, Ben said firmly. You've changed, Lydia. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for. A tear slipped down her cheek, and she quickly brushed it away, trying to compose herself. I just wish. I wish I could change the past. Ben pulled her into a tight hug, resting his chin on her head. You don't need to change it. We've both got our scars, mine just shows up on the outside. But we're still here. Together. And that's all that matters. They stood there in the dim light of the front hallway, holding each other in a silence that spoke louder than words. The house, with its cracked walls and dusty floors, seemed to echo with the years they'd lost, and the ones they still had yet to claim. The past, painful as it was, had brought them here, to this place, to each other. And for the first time, Lydia felt a small flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to forgive herself. As Lydia walked further into the house, she was struck by the heavy silence that seemed to cling to every room. Shadows lurked in the corners, and the air was thick with dust, floating lazily in the dim light seeping through the cracked windows. The furniture was covered in a layer of neglect, and the once warm space now felt strangely hollow, like a shell of its former self. Ben's footsteps echoed softly behind her as he led the way into the living room. He paused, glancing at her, then nodded toward the stone fireplace against the far wall. Its worn stones looked like they hadn't felt a flame in years, but they held a kind of rugged permanence that stood out amid the decay. Remember this? Ben asked, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips as he gestured toward the fireplace. Lydia looked at it, and the memories came rushing back. They'd spent countless nights gathered around that fireplace, the room filled with the crackling of wood and laughter, the smell of melting marshmallows as they'd roasted s'mores. The memories felt almost tangible, and for a moment, she could see a younger version of herself and Ben, their faces glowing in the firelight, carefree and innocent. I remember, she said softly, her voice almost lost in the stillness. It was our little world, right here. Just us and the fire. Ben chuckled, and the sound broke the silence, warming the space just a little. Mom and Dad would pretend to be annoyed with us for making a mess, but they always let us do it anyway. You insisted on putting way too much chocolate on each s'more. I thought Mom was going to kill you when you smeared it all over the couch that one time. A faint smile tugged at her lips. Hey, it was an accident. And besides, you were the one who dared me to see how much chocolate I could stack without it all melting everywhere. Ben laughed, shaking his head. Yeah, that's fair. But the mess you made was legendary. Took hours to clean that up. They both fell silent, each lost in their own memories of those happier times. The echoes of their laughter seemed to linger, and Lydia could almost feel the warmth of the fire that had once crackled there, a small island of light and comfort in the vastness of the room. Feels like forever ago, she murmured, her gaze fixed on the fireplace. Everything seemed so safe back then. Ben's face softened as he looked at her. We were safe, weren't we? It felt like nothing could touch us in this room. Lydia swallowed, feeling a weight in her chest as she looked at the cold, empty hearth. It's strange, how much has changed. And yet, standing here, it feels like we're right back in that same moment. Ben took a deep breath, his eyes glistening with his own memories. Maybe that's the hardest part. Knowing we can't go back to those nights. We're different now, the house is different. But those memories, they're still here, somehow. They survived, even when we didn't. She looked at him, her expression both wistful and haunted. I sometimes wish I could go back, just for a moment, and live in that warmth again. Like maybe we wouldn't feel so broken if we could just stay there a little longer. Ben nodded, his gaze drifting back to the fireplace. I know. But maybe that warmth doesn't have to be gone for good. Maybe it's just, waiting for us to bring it back. One piece at a time. Lydia glanced at him, surprised by the hope in his voice. You think we could? After everything? He reached out, wrapping an arm around her shoulders in a comforting hug. Yeah, LYDS, I do. Maybe we're carrying more scars now, and the house is a bit worse for wear, but the good memories, those are still here. And maybe we're strong enough to make some new ones. She leaned into his side, taking a shaky breath as she let herself feel the warmth of his presence. The darkness of the house felt a little less stifling, the silence a little less foreboding. For the first time in a long while, Lydia felt that maybe, just maybe, home wasn't as lost as she'd thought. As Lydia lingered near the fireplace, images from the past continued to unfurl in her mind, vivid and comforting. She could almost hear her mother's voice calling them in for dinner, her father's laughter filling the room, her and Ben's gleeful giggles as they burned marshmallows over the flames. It was as if, for a moment, they'd stepped into a long-lost fragment of time. But something felt off. Lydia's gaze drifted to Ben, who was staring at the fireplace with a slight frown, as if he, too, was trying to see the past through a haze. The warm, nostalgic light in his eyes had dulled, replaced by something else, a distant look, almost hollow. She studied him, the weight of his silence unsettling. Ben, she asked softly, breaking the quiet. What do you remember about all this? About us? The good times? Ben blinked, as if pulled out of a trance. He looked at her, a strange sadness coloring his gaze. I remember, some things, he replied slowly, his voice thick with something she couldn't quite place. But, honestly, LYDS, some of it feels blurred, like trying to see through fog. Do you feel that way? A cold shiver prickled Lydia's skin. She forced a small laugh, though it sounded hollow even to her own ears. Blurred? No, I mean, I remember everything. Us roasting s'mores, Mom and Dad teasing each other, all those late-night stories by the fire. She looked around, as if to ground herself in the memories. Don't you remember? Ben shook his head, his face marked with an odd, detached expression. I mean, I remember some of it, in flashes. But there's this distance, like I'm remembering someone else's life. He paused, his eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity. Do you ever wonder if maybe we're remembering it how we wanted it to be? Not how it actually was? The question hit her like a slap. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ben's gaze drifted back to the fireplace. Think about it, LYDS. We were just kids. Our parents, they were gone by the time we were, 17. And it wasn't like things were perfect even before that. We made it feel safe, like our little world, but that might have been more of our own creation. Maybe we needed it to be that way. Lydia's stomach twisted. But it was safe, Ben. That's how I remember it. That's what got us through, wasn't it? Ben shrugged, his voice soft. I think maybe we told ourselves that. Because, what else could we do? After they were gone, we only had each other. His expression softened. LYDS, I'm not saying those times weren't real or that they didn't matter. I just wonder if we've polished those memories, you know. So they wouldn't hurt so much. Her heart ached as she took in his words. It was as if a crack had opened in the wall of her own memories, a subtle fracture that revealed glimpses of scenes she'd buried. The small fights their parents had, the nights she'd heard her mother crying softly when she thought no one was listening, the tense silences that sometimes filled the room. "No," she murmured, shaking her head as if to ward off the unease settling over her. "No, Ben, I remember it. It was good. We had each other. It was us against the world." Ben's gaze turned soft, almost pitying, and he reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Lydia, it's okay if things weren't perfect. It's okay if we made it feel that way. That doesn't mean we didn't survive together or that those memories don't matter." She felt tears prickling at her eyes, a mixture of confusion, grief, and a strange, unnameable fear. "But, if the good memories aren't real, then what are we even holding on to?" Ben brushed a stray tear from her cheek, his voice steady but gentle. "Maybe the real memories are somewhere in between. The hard parts and the good parts, they were all pieces of us, of what we shared. And maybe that's enough. Maybe it has to be." She looked at him, her heart pounding as she tried to reconcile the bright, golden memories she'd always cherished with the shadows now creeping into her mind. For the first time, she wondered if she'd painted over the darker hues in her past, softening them until they barely resembled reality. Lydia felt her hand slip from his, her fingers shaking. "I don't know if I'm ready to look at it that way, Ben. I don't know if I can." Ben watched her, a sad understanding in his gaze. "You don't have to be ready yet, LYDS. We've both held on to what we needed to survive. But maybe it's time to let some of those illusions go, piece by piece." They stood in silence, shadows stretching around them, the old house listening as their memories cracked open, spilling secrets neither had been ready to confront. For Lydia, it felt like a part of her world was unraveling, but in Ben's presence, she found a strange comfort, a reassurance that maybe, they could face this truth together. As they sat on the worn sofa, Lydia noticed Ben had been unusually quiet, almost hesitant, as though weighing the next words on his tongue. After a moment, he grinned softly, looking over at her. "Remember Mom's apple schnapple?" Lydia's face softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Apple schnapple," she echoed, her voice colored with a bittersweet nostalgia. "She'd always make it just for us. Hot apple cider with that ridiculous amount of cinnamon and, what else did she put in it?" Ben chuckled, a low, familiar sound that brought Lydia back to chilly autumn nights and the sound of crickets through open windows. "Clove, I think. And a little too much honey. It was almost syrup." Lydia laughed, the memory warming her for a moment, as if she could feel the thick, sticky sweetness of the cider on her tongue. "Yeah, I remember. She'd pull out those mugs, the ones with the little chip on the side." She paused, her laughter fading as she felt an uncomfortable pang in her chest. "But she'd always seem a little, far away, wouldn't she?" Ben nodded, his face growing somber. "She was. I think she just tried to make it feel cozy for us, you know. She wanted us to feel safe." Lydia's brow furrowed. "But it was safe, wasn't it? I mean, sure, she was distracted sometimes, but, she loved us. And Dad, he always kept things together." Her voice wavered as the familiar walls of her memories seemed to waver. Ben's gaze was unwavering, his eyes carrying a weight she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. "LYDS, do you really remember it that way? I mean, think about it. Apple schnapple nights they were good, but they were also her way of making up for all those other nights." She glanced at him, the discomfort tightening in her chest. What other nights?" He hesitated, rubbing his hands together, searching for the right words. "The nights she'd be, locked in her room, or out with friends, gone until morning. And Dad, he would be drinking, you remember. It was, well, things weren't as perfect as we liked to remember." Lydia shook her head, trying to shake off the unease creeping up her spine. No. I mean, yeah, she had her own stuff going on, but, they loved us. They did what they could. Ben's face softened, but his voice was firm. I know they loved us, LYDS. But they were dealing with their own battles, their own demons, long before we could even understand it. The silence between them thickened, the room seeming darker somehow, the faded wallpaper taking on an oppressive weight. Lydia looked away, her throat tight. I don't know if I want to remember it like that. Why are you bringing this up? Because we have to be honest with ourselves, Ben said gently, his gaze unwavering. You and we've both been trying to hold on to the same version of the past. But maybe it's time to really look at it. She wanted to push back, to insist that he was wrong, that their childhood hadn't been so stained by shadows. But deep down, memories she'd buried long ago began to stir. Nights spent alone in her room, wondering why her mother hadn't come back. Her father's slurred voice trying to comfort her through a haze of alcohol. The way Ben had shielded her, told her stories to distract her when the world outside their room grew too frightening. Ben, she whispered, her voice trembling. Why are we doing this? Why does it even matter anymore? Because, he said, his voice almost breaking, we've been carrying this weight for too long, pretending it wasn't there. We can't move forward if we're still holding on to illusions. Lydia swallowed, a lump forming in her throat as the reality of his words settled over her like a heavy shroud. But, it was all we had, wasn't it? Those little moments. Those stories we told ourselves, they got us through. He nodded, his hand finding hers and giving it a reassuring squeeze. Yeah, they did. And they'll always be a part of us. But we don't have to hold on to the pain underneath it all, LYDS. We can let it go. She looked into his eyes, the truth they shared raw and undeniable. For so long, they'd built their memories around a fragile scaffold of half-truths, casting their parents in the best possible light to keep their childhood safe. But now, she could feel that structure crumbling, each fractured memory exposing new edges she'd long buried. Taking a shaky breath, Lydia nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm scared, Ben. I don't know how to let go of it. Ben smiled gently, brushing a tear from her cheek. We'll do it together. One piece at a time. They sat in silence, the unspoken truths between them finally given breath. And as they held each other, Lydia realized that perhaps facing the truth was the first step to finally being free. Lydia sat in the dimly lit room, her eyes still tracing the outline of the walls, but now they felt strangely unfamiliar. As she looked around, memories swirled in her mind, vivid and real, yet fleeting. She tried to hold on to them, but they slipped away like sand through her fingers. The once comforting space, the warmth of the fireplace, the laughter she thought she had heard, seemed less like a safe haven now and more like a hollow shell of a past she wasn't sure she could trust anymore. Ben noticed the shift in her demeanor. His brows furrowed in concern as he watched her gaze grow distant. LYDS. You okay? Lydia shook her head, her breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. It's strange, Ben. I don't know if I can trust my own memories anymore. He sat down next to her, the old couch creaking under his weight. What do you mean? The fireplace, she trailed off, as though trying to grasp it. I used to think it was this warm, cozy place where we were safe. But now, I don't know. I keep trying to picture it, but it's just a blank wall. Ben blinked, his confusion growing. What do you mean, a blank wall? The fireplace is still there. Lydia turned to him, her eyes wide with an intensity he hadn't seen in a while. But that's just it. It's not there. The memories are fading, warping. Like they were never real to begin with. Her voice cracked, and she clasped her hands tightly in her lap, as if trying to hold on to something solid. I keep questioning everything. Even the love we thought we had, was it real, Ben? Or was it just a story we told ourselves? Ben's face softened with concern, but there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. He understood more than he let on. I get it. The past, the way we remember it, sometimes it feels more like a dream, right? You hold on to those good moments because they're all you have left. Yeah, but what if those moments weren't even good? What if they were just lies? Lydia's words hung in the air between them, heavy and unyielding. She stood abruptly, pacing the room as her thoughts continued to spiral. Everything was just, so perfect, and then it wasn't, she murmured, more to herself than to him. And I don't know where the truth ends and the lie begins. Ben watched her, silent, unsure of what to say. But then, as if struck by a memory, he whispered, "There's something I haven't told you." Lydia stopped pacing, her attention now fully on him. "What do you mean?" Ben took a deep breath. "It's about that night. The one you've been trying to forget." Lydia's pulse quickened. "Which night?" she asked, but she knew exactly which one he meant. The night that always haunted her dreams, the one she tried to bury under layers of sobriety, guilt, and silence. "The kitchen," Ben murmured. "Do you remember that night?" Lydia's stomach tightened. The memory began to surface, but it wasn't how she remembered it. In her mind, the kitchen had always been the heart of their home, bright, warm, a place of family meals and quiet moments with their parents. But as Ben spoke, that image began to distort. She was back in that kitchen, but the warmth was gone, replaced by cold, sterile light. The air smelled of stale alcohol, the silence more oppressive than comforting. She closed her eyes, and in that instant, it all came rushing back, the images that shattered her idealized memories. The vision of her mother standing by the sink, her face partially turned toward Lydia, but the bruise on her cheek unmistakable, darkening the once familiar features. Her mother's eyes, distant, empty, as though she were somewhere else entirely. And then, her father. Slumped over in a chair at the table, his face red and bloated, a half-empty bottle of whiskey clutched in his hand. His breath came in uneven, ragged gasps, and he mumbled incoherently, his words slurring together. Lydia's throat constricted. "I remember. I remember now. I saw Mom. She had a bruise. A big one, on her cheek. And Dad, he was there, but he wasn't really there. He was drunk, and I." Her voice faltered as the scene became clearer in her mind. Ben's eyes softened with understanding, and he stood to join her, reaching out to steady her as she swayed on her feet. "It's okay, Lyds. You don't have to keep carrying this." "No, Ben," she whispered, shaking her head. "I can't," she took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I've been trying to pretend they weren't like that. I kept telling myself they loved us, that they did their best. But maybe they didn't. Maybe they were broken too, weren't they?" Ben's gaze was intense, his own pain reflected in his eyes. "They were, Lyds. They were broken. But they still loved us. They just didn't know how to show it." Lydia's hand trembled as she touched her face, her fingers brushing against the fading remnants of her old self. I can't look at them the same way anymore. I thought they were perfect, that they were this rock we could lean on. But, they were just as lost as we were." "I know," Ben whispered. "And that's what makes it so hard, isn't it? Realizing the people who were supposed to protect us couldn't even protect themselves." The air in the room seemed to thicken, the heaviness of her realizations sinking into her bones. She felt as though the walls were closing in, as if the very house was holding on to the same lies that had kept them trapped for so long. "I remember the look in her eyes," Lydia whispered, her voice raw. "She never said anything. But she was scared. And I should have known, Ben. I should have known what was happening." Ben wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as the weight of their shared trauma seemed to press them into the ground. "You were a kid, Lyds. You were never supposed to have to know." But Lydia, her face buried in his chest, felt the sharp sting of truth. She had been a kid, yes, but somewhere between the lies they told themselves and the chaos they lived, she had learned to ignore the things that made her uncomfortable, to shut her eyes to the darker parts of the world around her. And now, all those illusions were falling apart, piece by piece. Lydia stood frozen in the living room, her heart thumping in her chest. The air around her felt thicker, charged with something she couldn't quite place. Ben's voice, normally comforting and steady, had taken on an unfamiliar, almost chilling quality. "Come on, Lyds. I want to show you something." Ben's tone was quiet, too quiet, laced with an edge she hadn't heard before. Lydia looked at him, her brows knitting together. "What's going on, Ben? What are you talking about?" His eyes met hers, but there was something dark, distant in his gaze. "It's upstairs. The projector room," he said, as if the words were so ordinary, so unremarkable. Lydia frowned. "Projector room? There's no projector room. You know that." But Ben's expression hardened, and he cut her off with a terse, "Just follow me. Trust me, it's important." Fear began to settle deep in Lydia's stomach. She had spent so many years trying to shut out the past, but now, as she looked at Ben, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting between them. Something wasn't right. She could sense the weight of his words and the unspoken tension hanging in the air. "Ben," she started, but her voice faltered. "Why now? Why show me this now?" Ben didn't answer immediately. He simply turned, his steps heavy, echoing in the stillness of the house. Lydia followed him, her feet reluctant to move. Each step felt like she was being drawn into a web she didn't fully understand, but one that felt both inescapable and inevitable. They ascended the stairs, the house groaning with the weight of its history. The walls seemed to close in around her, their old memories pressing against her mind like forgotten whispers. The dim light flickered as they reached the top, casting strange shadows that made the hallway seem longer than she remembered. At the end of the hall was a door, slightly ajar, beyond which she could just make out the faint outline of what appeared to be an old film projector. Ben reached for the doorknob, his fingers trembling ever so slightly before he turned it. The door creaked open with an unsettling squeal, and Lydia's pulse quickened. Her eyes darted to Ben, but his face was unreadable now, his jaw clenched tight as though he were bracing for something that was about to happen. "Ben, what is this?" Lydia's voice cracked with anxiety, but he didn't answer. Instead, he stepped into the room and motioned for her to follow. Lydia hesitated, but then, unable to stop herself, she crossed the threshold. The room was dim, with only the soft glow of the projector casting eerie shadows on the walls. Old film reels sat in boxes scattered around, but it was the projector itself that seemed to hum with an unsettling presence. "Sit down," Ben said quietly, pointing to the worn chair in the corner. His voice was calm, but it carried a strange weight. "It's time to face it, Lydia." Lydia's throat tightened as she slowly sat down, her eyes never leaving the projector. She felt as though her body was moving on its own, as if it had no choice but to obey, to watch whatever Ben had in store. Ben moved behind the projector and flicked a switch, the room plunging into darkness for a split second before the soft whir of the machine began. The first image flickered onto the screen, a blur of motion, but it quickly came into focus. The scene was familiar, too familiar. It was her. She was in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel tightly, her face drawn in concentration. The sky was dark, rain streaking across the windshield. The sound of tires screeching echoed in the room, and Lydia's breath caught in her throat. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "No, no, no." The image on the screen shifted, and suddenly, the crash was happening. The car spinning out of control. The sound of metal twisting and glass shattering. Ben's screams, the agony in his voice, pierced through her mind, the vividness of it all flooding her senses. It was as though she was right back there, trapped in that moment, that single moment that had shattered everything. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images kept coming, relentless, unyielding. The impact. The sound of Ben's body slamming against the dashboard. His face, pale and ghostly in the flickering light. His blood, every detail etched in her memory. And then, the stillness. The terrifying silence. And her own hands, shaking as she tried to make sense of it all. Lydia opened her eyes again, and the film continued. The screen was filled with the aftermath, the hospital room, the machines beeping, the blood-soaked bandages. She saw herself standing in the doorway, her heart shattering as she watched Ben's lifeless body lying there, the tubes and wires keeping him tethered to life. Her mind couldn't process it, couldn't accept it. She felt the room close in around her, the walls pressing against her, suffocating her. She reached out, gripping the armrests of the chair, as though trying to ground herself, but the images kept flashing, faster now, one after the other, each one more brutal than the last. Ben's voice came from behind her, calm and almost detached. "You did this, Lyds. You killed me." Lydia's heart stopped. The words sank deep into her chest, twisting and choking her. "No. Ben, no." She turned to him, but his face was blank, unreadable, like a stranger she didn't recognize. The projector light flickered, casting an eerie glow on his features. "You were the one who was supposed to be in control," he continued, his voice colder now. "But you weren't. And because of that, I almost died." Lydia stood, trembling, her hands shaking as she backed away from the screen. "Please, Ben, stop." The projector clicked off with a soft thud, and the room plunged into darkness. The air was thick, suffocating, and Lydia felt as though she were choking on her own guilt. Ben was silent now, standing still in the shadows. Lydia could hear the shallow rise and fall of her breath, the pounding of her heart in her ears. Slowly, she turned to face him, but the look in his eyes wasn't one of anger, it was something far more haunting, a resigned sadness, a deep well of grief that she had never fully acknowledged until now. "Ben, Lydia whispered, her voice broken. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you." Ben's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through her like a knife. "But you did, Lyds. And it's something we both have to live with. I wasn't just a memory to bury. I was real. And now, so is the damage you caused." Lydia's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the floor, sobbing. The weight of her guilt, the truth that she had buried so deep, all came crashing down on her. The crash had stolen Ben's life, yes, but it had stolen a part of her too. And as the darkness enveloped them both, Lydia realized the truth she had been running from all these years: she had never truly escaped the crash. It had never left her. It was still happening. Lydia's eyes fluttered open, and the harsh fluorescent light of the hospital room made her head pound. Her body felt heavy, as if she had been submerged in water, fighting for air. She blinked rapidly, trying to focus, trying to make sense of the disorienting pull of reality that felt wrong. The beeping of machines filled the silence around her, rhythmic and mechanical, like the pulse of a world that kept turning no matter what happened. She turned her head slightly, feeling the soft pressure of a bandage on her temple. Her eyes wandered to the side, where a nurse was writing something on a clipboard, a calm but professional expression on her face. Where am I?" Lydia rasped, her throat dry, the words leaving her lips like foreign sounds. The nurse, startled by the sudden movement, turned and smiled softly. "You're in the hospital, Ms. Westbrook. You've been unconscious for a few days. You've had a lot of rest. Dr. Haskell will be in shortly to talk to you." Lydia tried to sit up, her body protesting, but she managed to push herself into a semi-upright position. The dizziness was overwhelming, but the nurse adjusted the pillows behind her, offering a small, reassuring smile. "Take it easy. You've been through quite a lot." Lydia nodded absently, her mind already racing. The hospital room felt sterile, too clean, too real. She tried to recall what had happened, but the fragments of her memory seemed scattered, blurred like a dream she couldn't remember waking from. She reached up to touch her head, where the bandage was wrapped tightly. The door to her room creaked open, and Lydia's gaze snapped toward it. Dr. Haskell stepped inside, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos she was feeling inside. His glasses glinted under the overhead light, and he offered a professional yet sympathetic smile as he approached her bedside. "Lydia, it's good to see you awake," Dr. Haskell said, his voice measured and calm. He sat down in the chair beside her, adjusting his clipboard. "How are you feeling?" Lydia opened her mouth to speak, but the words felt tangled in her throat. I don't understand. What happened? Where's Ben?" Her breath hitched, her heart clenching at the thought of her brother, her twin, the person she'd shared every secret, every joy, every sorrow with. Dr. Haskell's face softened, and he leaned forward slightly. "Lydia," he said gently, "Ben isn't here. You've been through a very intense experience, one that's been part of your treatment." Lydia's brow furrowed, and she shook her head, trying to piece together the fragments of her thoughts. "What are you talking about?" "Ben was just here. I was just with him." She looked around frantically, as if expecting him to walk in at any moment. Dr. Haskell's expression became serious, his eyes filled with empathy. "Lydia, I need you to listen to me. You've been undergoing a form of therapy called simulation therapy. It's a technique we've been using to help you confront your repressed memories, your trauma." The words didn't register at first. Lydia blinked, her mind desperately trying to process what he was saying. "Simulation therapy," she whispered, the phrase foreign to her. But I saw him. I saw Ben. I was in the house, we were talking, and..." Her voice trailed off, and she gripped the sides of the bed, suddenly feeling unmoored. A deep, growing unease settled in her chest. Is it all a lie? Was everything just, in my head? Her voice broke on the last word, her chest tightening with the impossible realization. The images, the conversations, the moments she had shared with Ben, they were real to her, so painfully real. Dr. Haskell nodded gently. "Yes, Lydia. The experiences you had during the simulation, they were not real. Your mind created them as a way of coping with the guilt and pain you've been carrying. We've been working together to help you confront your memories, to understand what really happened." Lydia shook her head, her fingers trembling as she clutched the sheets. "No. Ben, he was here, he was alive, I didn't kill him. I didn't mean to hurt him, Dr. Haskell held up a hand, his voice steady but kind. "Lydia, I know how difficult this is for you. But you need to understand that Ben died 2 years ago, in that car accident. Your mind created the simulation as a way of holding on to him, as a way to avoid the grief and guilt you've been carrying." The room seemed to spin as the weight of his words sank in. She felt a coldness creeping up her spine, an overwhelming sense of dread filling her veins. 2 years, she whispered hoarsely. Her breath became shallow, and she felt her chest tighten. It was as though the floor had been ripped from beneath her, leaving her hovering in a pit of uncertainty. Dr. Haskell gave her a moment to process, his voice softening. "You were driving that night, Lydia. You were under the influence, and you lost control of the car. Ben was in the passenger seat." He paused, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle. "It was a terrible accident, but it wasn't your fault. The guilt you feel, it's part of the trauma you're working through. You're not alone in this. You've made tremendous progress, Lydia. You're facing the hardest part now." Lydia felt the sting of tears pooling in her eyes, the truth finally crashing into her like a tidal wave. She squeezed her eyes shut, unable to stop the flood of emotion threatening to overtake her. She had imagined every moment, every word with Ben, as though he were still alive, as though they were still together in the warmth of those childhood memories. But it had all been a construct of her mind, a way to survive the unbearable truth of his death. I didn't mean for it to happen," Lydia whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to kill him, Dr. Haskell. I didn't mean it." Dr. Haskell leaned forward, his voice reassuring but firm. "I know, Lydia. I know. And that's why you're here. You're healing. You're facing the truth. It's going to take time, but you will get through this." The tears she had been holding back spilled over, and Lydia let them fall, her sobs racking her body. She felt as though she were being torn apart by the weight of it all, the loss, the guilt, the realization that Ben would never walk through that door again. For the first time, as she allowed herself to grieve the brother she had lost, Lydia realized that facing the truth, no matter how painful, was the first step toward healing. And maybe, just maybe, she could start living again, even if it meant learning how to carry the weight of her past. Lydia sat on the edge of the hospital bed, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as Dr. Haskell watched her with quiet patience. The room, with its cold walls and sterile scent, felt both suffocating and empty. Her mind was still reeling from the revelation, from the weight of the truth that had been hidden from her for so long. Ben was gone. He had been gone for 2 years. The images of him, the memories that felt so real, were nothing but fragments of a mind desperate to hold on to something, anything, that resembled normalcy. Dr. Haskell cleared his throat gently, breaking the silence. "Lydia, I know this isn't easy. Facing the truth, confronting your past, it's painful. But this is how you heal. It's essential. Every step you take toward understanding, every moment you allow yourself to feel the pain, is a moment closer to freedom." Lydia didn't respond immediately. Her gaze dropped to her hands, still trembling slightly. She felt so small, as if she were a child again, lost in the shadow of her own guilt. The room felt oppressive, and the weight of Dr. Haskell's words hung heavily in the air. "Will it ever go away?" Lydia's voice was barely a whisper, her words thick with the weight of her emotions. "The guilt, the loss, will I ever be free of it? I keep seeing Ben. I keep hearing his voice. And even though I know it's not real, part of me wants to hold on to it, to him. I don't know if I can let go." Dr. Haskell nodded, his expression softening with empathy. "The truth is, Lydia, you may never be completely free of the guilt or the loss. They are part of you now, part of what you've been through. But that doesn't mean you're trapped. You don't have to let them control you. You can learn to live alongside them, to acknowledge them without letting them define who you are." Lydia's eyes glistened with unshed tears, and she blinked rapidly, fighting to keep them at bay. "I don't know if I can do that. Sometimes, I wonder if I even want to. These moments, these glimpses of Ben, those fleeting memories, it feels like they're the only thing keeping me sane. Without them, I don't know what's left." Dr. Haskell gave her a moment, allowing the weight of her words to settle. Then he leaned forward, his voice steady and filled with quiet conviction. "I understand. Those moments with Ben, however brief they may be, are part of your healing process, too. But as you continue to confront the truth, you'll begin to find new sources of solace. New ways to connect with your brother that don't rely on illusions or memories." Lydia let out a shaky breath, trying to process what he was saying. "I don't even know how to begin. It feels like I've lost him twice now, once when the accident happened, and again when I had to let go of the fantasy that he was still with me." Dr. Haskell's gaze softened, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "It's a double loss, I know. But it's important to remember, Lydia, that letting go of the fantasy doesn't mean you've lost him completely. It's part of the process of honoring his memory, of finding a way to carry his spirit with you in a healthy way." Lydia was silent for a long time, her mind a whirl of conflicting emotions. The room seemed to close in on her, the walls pressing tighter as she tried to come to terms with everything she had just learned. Finally, she looked up at Dr. Haskell, her eyes tired but steady. "I'll keep showing up. For the therapy. For myself. I'll try. But..." She paused, her throat tightening. "But will I ever feel like I'm really living again? Like I'm not just a shadow of who I used to be?" Dr. Haskell smiled gently, a quiet encouragement in his eyes. "You've already made an incredible step by coming here, by facing the truth, and by deciding to keep moving forward. That's what matters. And over time, as you continue the work, you'll find that the burden becomes lighter. Healing doesn't mean forgetting, Lydia. It means integrating the loss into your life in a way that lets you continue to grow. It's a journey, but I believe you can find your way through it." Lydia nodded slowly, her heart heavy but filled with a fragile glimmer of hope. It was a feeling she hadn't allowed herself to have in a long time, and it frightened her almost as much as it comforted her. She had spent so long in the darkness, buried under layers of guilt and grief, that the idea of hope, of peace, felt foreign, almost unattainable. But something in Dr. Haskell's words resonated deep inside her. "It's a journey." "Okay," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I'll keep going. I'll keep trying." Dr. Haskell gave a reassuring nod. "And you're not alone in this, Lydia. You'll have the support you need every step of the way." As Lydia sat there, absorbing his words, she couldn't help but feel a faint shift within herself. The road ahead would be long, and there would be moments when the past would come rushing back, flooding her with guilt and sorrow. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could find a way to move forward. That she could take what remained of her love for Ben and use it to rebuild herself. As the minutes passed, the heavy weight of the past didn't disappear, but the spark of possibility, of a future that wasn't defined by loss, began to glow faintly in the darkness. It was small, like a flicker of light in the distance, but it was enough for Lydia to hold on to. The healing would take time. But for the first time in years, Lydia had a glimpse of hope that she could walk that path toward healing, even if it meant facing the truth that had once been too painful to bear. And that was enough to start.